Hi everyone, welcome to this Facebook Live at Harvard Business Review. My name is Susan David. I'm a psychologist at Harvard Medical School, the founder or a co-founder of the Institute of Coaching at McLean Hospital, and the author of Emotional Agility. I'm so thrilled to be here today to discuss probably one of the most important topics in all of our lives: how to build resilience, and in that context, how to manage stress and change. So we wanted to start this Facebook Live with a very quick question. What is a key way that you use in your own life to manage your stress? So please, can you let us know some of the ways that you manage stress in your own life? And feel free to also chime in with where you're watching from. So I'm so excited to really talk about this idea because it is critical. The World Health Organization tells us that by 2030, depression, not cancer, not heart disease, not diabetes, depression will be the single leading cause of disability globally. And there are many reasons for this, but one of them is the unprecedented change and complexity that so many of us are experiencing in our lives today. So the principles that I want to talk about in terms of how to build stress and resilience apply in all aspects of our lives and in the context of all different types of stress and change. So what do I mean by this? These principles are principles that apply both to major life stresses, for example, illness or breakup of relationships or job loss, but they also apply to everyday stresses. You are angry with your boss, your idea has been stolen at work, you applied for a job that you really wanted and didn't get it. These principles also apply to stresses that others put on you. For example, there's a change in the workplace, and suddenly your role has shifted in ways that you never imagined. But as equally, it applies to stress that you have chosen in your own life. Because one of the great myths of stress is that all stress is bad. We don't get to grow in our lives. We don't get to enjoy and find meaning in our lives unless we walk towards discomfort. So, for example, if you have started a company and it's a company that you really believe in and want to be involved with, you may still find that stressful. So not all stress is bad, and one of the things that I'm going to talk about in this Facebook Live is how to navigate these different ways of experiencing stress, both wanted and unwanted. So again, welcome. Please let us know how you deal with stress in your life. We are featuring live from Harvard Business Review's offices, and I'm so thrilled to be here to talk about this incredibly important topic. So let me start off by talking about a key way that I came to this question in my own life. And it's a personal story. But really, if we think about the idea of stress, if we think about the idea of resilience, how to grow and how to thrive, really what we are fundamentally talking about is a key question that I hope to discover with you on this Facebook Live. And it is this: what does it take internally in the way we deal with our thoughts, our emotions, the stories that we tell ourselves, and the experiences that we have every day in every way that help us to live our best life in all aspects, in how we love, in how we live, in how we parent, in how we work, and in how we lead. So I first came to this question in my own life when I was 16 years old. My father, who was an icon of warmth and kindness and a rock to me, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he was given months to live. Now, on the one hand, I experienced what so many of us experience in our lives with our change and with our stress. And it is this. So many people came to me and said things like, just be positive. Everything will be okay. If you just think positive, everything will be fine. Just grit through it, and you'll see you'll come out the other end. But I wasn't fine. My father was dying and then dead. And it was a very difficult, very traumatic experience for me. It was an experience that was very isolating and one that a lot of my peers had not gone through. And so on the one hand, I had this whole narrative of just think positive. You know, just think positive, everything's going to be okay, everything will be fine. And then I had this remarkable experience. I had a teacher, and this teacher knew what I was going through. And she invited me, along with the rest of the class, to keep journals. And so began this secret, silent correspondence with this remarkable woman, where every day I would write in this journal about what I was going through, my regrets, my trauma, my loss, my sense of isolation, my struggling through things, my guilt that I was having fun sometimes when my father was ill. And every day I would hand this journal in, and I would get the most beautiful, heartfelt comments, questions, poetry, stories from this amazing woman. Now, what I realized after that experience is that it was someone seeing me, but more importantly, me seeing myself, that ultimately helped me to be resilient and to thrive beyond that experience. And I now do walk through life, and I've had many other difficult transitional experiences. I dropped out of college. I've had a whole range of experiences that have been tough. But I walk through life with a sense of myself as someone who can cope and navigate change in ways that are effective. So this sparked my career. You know, what is it in terms of what society tells us versus what is the reality of how we can walk through a world that is not perfect? How we can walk through a world where life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility, where we are young until we're not, we're in relationships that are wonderful and thriving until that person is there no longer, but as equally, where we are in a job that we love until we don't, or where we feel heard at work until our voice seems like it doesn't matter. These are all stresses that all of us experience. And what I recognized in, on the one hand, this idea of just think positive versus this experience with this journal, this black book that I still have today, of being seen, of showing up to my emotions, is I started to delve into the research and the work and became ultimately a psychologist, where I'm now at Harvard Medical School, and an emotions researcher, answering these key questions. What does it really take for us to thrive in an imperfect, ever-changing, stressful, and complex world? So what are some of the key principles? Well, the first is that we actually know that forcing positive thinking doesn't work. While the narrative is that we should think positive and be positive all the time, there are some key problems with that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-happiness or anti-being positive. I'm a very positive person, and in fact, I wrote an 80-chapter end-to-end textbook called the Oxford Handbook of Happiness on what we know about human happiness. So I'm not anti-happiness and I'm not anti being positive. But what we know from the research is this. So often when we slap on a happy face, when underneath us we are struggling with sadness or anger or grief or disappointment, what this does is takes away from our opportunity to learn, to grow, and to ultimately be resilient. Now, why is this? Firstly, when we are feeling something inside, and instead what we do is we just pretend and try to push those emotions aside, we know from the research that there is this remarkable psychological effect that is called amplification. Amplification is quite simply this. Imagine you are on a diet and you've decided that you are not going to eat chocolate cake. So you don't want to think about chocolate cake and you just aren't going there. What we know is that trying not to think about something leads to a boomerang effect where you start thinking about that thing all the time. You start dreaming about that very thing that you feel that you cannot have. And we know that the same applies with difficult situations. When you are upset because you didn't get the promotion, or you're angry at a team member who you feel is not pulling their weight, but you decide that you are just going to push it aside, get on with it, be focused on the project, ignore it. Often what that leads to is a boomerang effect where you start thinking about it more and more often, where in a meeting you land up being snide to that very colleague who you pretended you were going to just ignore it to. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about wearing your emotions on a sleeve or always letting your emotions out. But what I'm suggesting is that when you are struggling with something, one of the key principles of resilience is this: showing up to your emotions. Showing up to your emotions in the same way as that teacher did with me, in that same way that I did with myself. Being able to say, what is it that I'm feeling? What is going on for me here is a critical aspect of our resilience. Now, one of the other reasons that positive thinking doesn't necessarily work is that our emotions have evolved to help us survive. As a species, we need our emotions, we need our fear, we need our anger. Yes, they often feel uncomfortable. Yes, they often are not things that are pleasant. But these emotions often contain signals to the things that we most care about in our world. So, for example, when you are feeling stressed because of change in the workplace, that is a sign to you that job security and that security is really important, and that predictability is important, and that at the moment your job may not be as secure as you thought. If you are angry and stressed because someone stole your idea at work, what that signals to you is that you have a key value, which is around equity and fairness. So when we just push our emotions aside in the service of a smiley face, what we are doing is we are very often stealing from ourselves some key learning. What are my values that sit underneath this emotion? What is this emotion telling me about my situation? Now, very importantly, The fact that you feel an emotion doesn't mean that that emotion is right. It doesn't mean that because you are angry with your boss, you should be angry with your boss and your boss is wrong and you are right. It may be the case. Emotions are data, not directions. So we can look into our emotions as pieces of information that often contain signals to things that we value, but we don't necessarily need to have them drive us. In emotional agility, I talk about how we often get hooked into our emotions, believing them and acting on them in ways that don't necessarily serve us. So what I'm talking about here is the idea that our emotions contain signals, are important, and that when we push our difficult emotions and our difficult thoughts aside, what it actually does is it undermines our resilience and undermines our learning. Now, we often push our emotions aside with the best of intentions because society tells us to, or because that's the way we've been raised, or because we've got a big project to do and pushing our emotions aside seems effective. So really what's really critical is that if you push your emotions aside just one day because you've got a big project or you're going to a job interview, that's not a huge deal. But when you start using characteristic ways where time and time again, I'm stuck in my job, but at least I've got a job, so I'm just going to ignore it. When it becomes a trend in your life around particular emotions or particular experiences, that's when you need to start paying attention to the fact that you are likely, even with good intentions, undermining your resilience. So we want to be able to show up to our emotions, to recognize that positive thinking is maybe well and good in some situations, but in really dealing effectively with stress and in helping to cultivate resilience, positive thinking is very often an errand that is not met with success. We know that people who chase too much happiness and too much positive thinking actually become less happy over time. So what does this mean then? When you are dealing with difficult situations, what do you do with that stress? I'm angry with my boss. I'm frustrated with my coworker. I'm stuck in my job. There's all this change going on. I'm ill. My relationship isn't working out. Often what we find, and what I talk about in emotional agility, is that people tend to use one of two strategies. They will either do what I mentioned before, which is what we call bottle. They bottle their emotions. And we're going to put a poll up now, which is, are you a bottler, are you a brooder, or are you a bit of both, flipping from one to the next? A bottler is someone who pushes emotions aside in order to get through the day or achieve their goal, but ultimately those emotions come back. And what they're doing is they are not actually hearing the data from their emotions, and more importantly, when we keep saying to ourselves, I'm just going to ignore it, we are avoiding the very situation that is causing us the stress. And so we are not changing, shaping, tweaking, or managing that situation in a proactive and constructive way. So the stress stays and the situation stays. Bottling ultimately doesn't work. What about its opposite? What about brooding? Where bottling is pushing emotions aside, often when people are feeling stressed, they brood. Oh my goodness, I'm so stressed. I feel stuck in my job. This is terrible. What should I do? And we can also, of course, co-brood, where everyone is stressed at work, where everyone is going through change, and we all hang around the water cooler, all telling each other how stressed we are. That can make us feel better about our co-workers, but what we know from the research is that, again, it undermines our resilience and it undermines our capability to work through the situation. So brooding is where you go over and over and over your emotions time and time again. And while that is the opposite of bottling, we know that brooding has similar consequences. That when you brood, you are so often stuck in your world that you aren't making effective changes, that you aren't shaping your environment, and you are ultimately being in your world rather than being in the world. Bottling and brooding, or sometimes people flip from one to the other, where they avoid their emotions and then dwell and then go back. Bottling and brooding are both associated with lower levels of well-being, higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of burnout, higher levels of stress over time. They are not effective strategies. So what do? We need to be able to show up to our emotions. And I'm going to talk later about very simple strategies to do this. But what am I feeling? What is going on for me? I'm struggling here. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling stressed. These are critical things to start tapping into in ways that ultimately help you to be more effective. A key part of resilience also is doing what I call self-care and self-kindness. So often when people are going through difficult, stressful change situations, they beat themselves up. They're going through a divorce and they blame themselves. They're going through a job loss and they blame themselves. They've had a failure at work and they blame themselves. And so again, we live in a society that would often have us believe that we are running a never-ending Iron Man or Iron Woman competition. And that somehow being kind to ourselves is about being weak, it's about being lazy, and it's about being dishonest. The research shows the opposite. What the research shows is that people who are kind to themselves, people who recognize that they are doing the best with what they've got, with who they are, with the resources that they have in the world today, and that they are kind to themselves, treating themselves with compassion. Those individuals, what they are ultimately doing is they are creating a space within themselves that is psychologically safe, where they are safe from themselves. Now, this internal psychological safety, what does it do? Firstly, it helps people to be more motivated. It helps people to grow more. It helps people to recover from setbacks. So where the myth of self-compassion is that it's about being weak, lazy, and lying to yourself, we know that the opposite is true. That self-compassion is a prerequisite for resilience, for thriving, and change. So how do we get to the space where we show up effectively to our emotions? I'm going to give some key and very practical strategies that I explore in emotional agility, but that are fundamental to our well-being. The first, when you are experiencing a difficult emotion, we know that many people use stock standard phrases to describe that emotion. So they'll say something like, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. And soon everyone at work is talking about how stressed they are. But there is a world of difference between being stressed versus angry, stressed versus fearful, stressed versus disappointed, stressed versus, I thought my career would be so much more than it is, and I have a real sense of loss in my life. Now, imagine I am coaching an executive or a leader, and that person says to me, I'm stressed. if I just took that stress at face value, I might say to the person, well, let's learn how to delegate more. But what if the stress is, I'm in the wrong career? At that point, advice about delegation just doesn't cut it. So we know that a critical aspect of resilience and well-being is this. Instead of labeling your emotions with the first emotion that comes to mind, try to be more granular. What are two other options of what I'm experiencing here? Because we know that when people get to a more granular level around their emotions, what it ultimately does is helps them to understand the cause of the emotion, the reality of the situation more effectively, and it also enables them to start planning change. We know that when we put things into words, that actually starts to activate the readiness potential in our brains, the part of our brains that helps us to set goals and to work forward towards change. I'll interrupt just very briefly if you're tuning in now to say, welcome everyone. I'm Susan David, a psychologist at Harvard Medical School. I'm joining you from the Harvard Business Review's offices, where we are talking about resilience, how to build resilience, and in that context, how to manage stress and change. That is so much the reality of everyone's lives. Please feel free to write in, let us know where you are joining us from. Let us know if you have any answers to this question, which is, how do you deal with stress in your own life, or how do you cultivate your own resilience? And towards the end of this live, we'll have some question time where you can ask me anything around this particular topic. So labeling emotions is critical. Another very important strategy is you're sitting in a meeting and you are feeling undermined, you are feeling stressed, you are feeling put upon. Notice your thought and your feeling for what it is. Your thought is a thought. It's not a fact. Your emotion is an emotion. It's not a fact. Who's in charge? The thinker or the thought? Who's in charge? The emotion or you, the individual who is big enough and full enough and complex enough and beautiful enough to experience a multitude of emotions? So when you are sitting in that meeting and you are saying to yourself, I am angry, I'm just going to shut down, there's no point in talking, instead notice your thought or feeling for what it is. I'm noticing that I'm feeling anxious. I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry. I'm noticing the urge to shut down. I'm noticing that I'm not putting my hand up when in fact I really want to. When we notice our feelings and our emotions for what they are, literally by very simply saying, I'm noticing the feeling, I'm noticing this thought, we do something that is critical psychologically. We move ourselves into the space where instead of bottling the emotion, pushing it aside, we are with it, but we're also not brooding on the emotion. Instead, we are seeing that emotion for what it is. We are observing that emotion. And this ability to take an observer stance is critical to our well-being. If we think about, for example, the experience of depression, when people feel depressed, they often experience depression as something that is here to stay. I feel surrounded by this emotion. And so we know this practice of starting to cultivate the ability to notice our emotions with courage, with curiosity, and with compassion is a cornerstone to resilience and to thriving. I'm now going to talk very briefly to a second critical strategy, and that is knowing your why. What do I mean by this? When we are going through change and stress, it is so easy for us to be caught up in what is called social contagion. Social contagion is where everyone in the office is experiencing stress and we feel stress. Everyone is looking on their cell phones in an elevator and we pick up our cell phone in the elevator. We know, for example, in some research that if you are trying to lose weight and you are sitting on an airplane and your seat partner buys candy, even if you don't know the person, you are 30% more likely to buy candy. So we get automatically, very frequently impacted by other people's behaviors and other people's emotions in ways that become contagious and in ways that ultimately undermine our own resilience, where we compare ourselves and we adopt behaviors, actions, and strategies that ultimately are not about who we are. So knowing your why, and this is something that I explore in emotional agility, is one of the most critical aspects to resilience and thriving and fulfillment and success in our lives. What do I mean by this? Knowing who you are, knowing what you stand for, knowing what is important to you is fundamental. So an example, everyone is running around talking about the stress and about the change. But you know in your heart that being a contributor is a key value of yours. What that knowledge does is it helps to buffer you, it helps to protect you from the stress of social contagion. Yes, there's all of this going on around me, but I still choose to contribute. Knowing, for example, that learning and growth are core values to you, not just at the back of your mind or in some cheesy way put on a bulletin board in an office, but really something that is personal to you, helps you to say, learning and growth are important. And so while I'm not loving this change, while I'm not loving this stress, I'm still choosing to learn what I can from the situation. So we know that knowing your why is a core, fundamental aspect of human resilience, protecting us in every way in our lives and in every area of our careers, of our leadership, and of our ultimate lifelong growth. Lastly, we talk about our emotions, we talk about our values, knowing your why. But we also know that we can cultivate real and important habits on the ground that enable us to be resilient and enable us to be effective. So one very important habit is the habit of mindset. Human beings are naturally drawn to situations that feel comfortable. We may be in a relationship or in a job that we can do with our eyes shut, or where we go out to dinner and we know exactly what our spouse is going to talk about over dinner. Now, this feels very comfortable, but it is a sign of what I call in emotional agility overcompetence, where we become so trapped by what at first feels comfortable that comfort ultimately creates a prison around ourselves, that we step into a cage of comfort that undermines our resilience, stops our growth, and stops our thriving. While we are all drawn to comfort, there is a curse to comfort, and that is that it ultimately weakens our lives. It weakens our resilience. It weakens our exploration. It weakens the depth and breadth and richness of our experience. So comfort feels comfortable, but it is a curse. At the same time, we don't want to be overwhelmed, in which we feel like we're constantly drowning. So we should always, in helping to cultivate our own resilience, try to do this. Move yourself towards the edge of your ability. If you're feeling stressed or stuck in your job, it doesn't mean you have to give up your job. You can look for ways that you can make small tweaks, small changes that are meaningful, that are values connected, that will help you. So for example, I keep saying no to this thing, even though I know that doing this project would help me to grow. How can you move yourself knowing that your value is one of growth and keep on making what I call towards moves? You in that meeting and you've got a choice point. Do you make a move that is away from your value of growth, or do you make a move that is towards, putting your hand up and saying yes? As long as that thing is meaningful to you, values connected, it will help you to grow and to thrive. Very importantly also is this: stress has a bad name. People talk about trying to avoid stress, trying to do away with stress. There is no such thing as living a meaningful life, as raising kids, as having an effective career, as living a life of purpose. There's no such thing as living a meaningful life that doesn't involve stress. Discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. So what that means is recognizing that we don't get to climb Mount Everest and not have some cold and dark and rainy days is really important. That being able to move towards stress is often, as long as it's values aligned, a critical aspect. And within that, recognizing this, that we're not trying to do away with stress. We're not trying to do away with discomfort, because courage ultimately is not the absence of fear. It's not the absence of stress. Courage is about noticing your stress, noticing your fear, noticing your emotions with curiosity and compassion, and still choosing to move in the direction of your values. And lastly, create in your life what I call want-to habits. Want-to habits are habits that are values aligned, but that help to manage your situation and your context more effectively. And please, at this point, I'm starting to close off, so if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them, because I'm going to have a couple of minutes to take viewers' questions. So what do I mean by want-to habits? If you find that you've got a daily stress, and I'm going to use a very simple example of you lose your keys, you don't have your charger for your cell phone. This is what we call allostatic stress, this everyday stress. What we need to start doing is cultivating habits that ultimately enable us to mitigate and to manage those stressful situations, those allostatic stressful situations. So for example, one of the things that I talk about in emotional agility is what I call piggybacking. The idea that if you've already got a habit in your life, you already go home and put your keys in the drawer, and you do that every day, you can piggyback with a new habit onto that existing habit. So you're going to now put your keys in the drawer and your cell phone charger and your cell phone so that everything is there. Creating habits, not just for the sake of it, but that are true want-to habits, values-aligned habits, are critical to help us managing stress. And within that, these are also habits around self-care. Fundamental to our lifelong resilience and well-being are getting enough sleep, doing enough exercise, trying to eat in ways that are healthy, and again, recognizing that these are not because you have to do them, but because they are fundamentally important to you. And lastly, the habit of cultivating relationships. Because while we live in a world that is technology driven, it is the support of others that truly also enables us to become resilient. So showing up to our emotions, knowing our why, and cultivating want-to goals is absolutely fundamental to our ability to manage stress and change, and to build resilience in all aspects of our lives, in how we love, in how we live, in how we parent, in how we work, and in how we lead. Thank you so much for watching. I'm open to any questions that you have, anything at all, about stress, resilience, and emotions in your life. And I think we already do have a question.
Yes, we have a question from Andre, and he's actually asking about the poll question that you mentioned before about brooding versus bottling. And his question is, do you see any particular age or period where bottling or brooding are worsened?
So that's a really interesting question. So the question is, do we see any particular age where bottling or brooding are worsened? So not a particular age, but two particular contexts. The first is that often when people are experiencing a lot of stress in their lives, and especially when that stress feels uncontrollable in some way, they will tend to exacerbate and draw on their bottling or brooding habit more frequently. So that thing that was there becomes more and more of a tendency. The other thing that we know about bottling and brooding is that sometimes these habits around bottling and brooding happen from when we are children. So for example, if we grow up in a family where the display rule, what is called display rules in families, are we don't do anger here, we don't do sadness. What that can lead to is an individual not actually feeling comfortable with anger or sadness, and so pushing those emotions aside in a characteristic way. So we find, and we also do find some gender differences. We find, for example, that men in general tend to bottle emotions more, whereas women in general tend to brood on emotions more. But these gender differences are so interesting, but what's more fundamental here is there this thing that you are doing that is not helping you? Like, what does this look like for you in your personal life, and how does it impact you? So another question. Thank you for that. That was a great question.
Yes, I wanted to just jump in quickly and say that the poll results are in.
Oh, tell us. We're listening to how many bottlers, how many brooders, and how many a bit of both?
Yeah, so we have 19% are bottlers, 24% brooders, and 50% identify as both.
Okay, so around 20%, and then, so 20% bottle, around 20% brood, and then some people kind of flip from one to the other. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with bottling or brooding if it's an in-the-moment strategy. You know, I've got a job interview and my girlfriend just broke up with me. You know, you may absolutely, by definition, in order to be effective in that interview, need to push your emotions aside and go into the interview. But it's when you're starting to use these strategies in characteristic ways around particular situations. The person who month on month says, I'm unhappy in my job, but I'm just going to ignore it. And then 5 years later, that person is still in the same job, ignoring it, but now far more miserable. That's what we're talking about here. So thank you. One more question. I know we are nearly at the end.
Yes, one more question. So Adi is asking, I totally agree on the fact that stress is necessary to take a step forward and realize your potential eventually. But how can you control its level at transition points in your life while changing careers or moving to another country, for example?
Okay, so yes, I have moved. So the question is, we know that stress is helpful, but what about when you're going through real transition points in your life? For example, you're changing jobs or you're moving to another country. Having moved to 4 countries in my life and changed many jobs, I hear exactly what you're talking about. Sometimes, so we need to recognize that these situations are stressful. there is a difference between what I call a have-to goal and a want-to goal. A have-to goal is where you say, I have to move jobs because I hate the one that I'm in. You know, I have to move countries. I have to move states. Now, have-to language is very interesting language because what happens when we have to language is we can start wrapping ourselves in the story of the thing that I have to do. And we know psychologically that when people wrap themselves in a have to, what do? We become resentful, we become more stressed, and we become less adaptable to the situation that we are facing. And we often do this in very subtle ways without even realizing it. So, I have to go to the meeting today. I have to give this person feedback. I have to, apply for a new job. Have to language, what it does is it actually undermines our resilience. Have to is very often done out of a sense of obligation and shame. Now, if you take that same goal and you try to surface, this is why knowing your why is so important. If you try to surface the why am I doing this? Yes, I hate my job, but what is that emotion telling me about the kind of job or the kind of things that I value in my workplace that I'm not getting from this current workplace? If you can start recognizing your want to and surfacing your want to, that is this values-aligned thing in the situation, in the stress that you're facing, it is a critical aspect then to being able to deal with that stress effectively. So I have to give this person feedback versus fairness is really important to me. How fair is it if I don't give this person feedback? How fair is it to the rest of the team? How fair is it to myself? If you can start surfacing your want to true value around the stress, it significantly de-escalates that stress and creates a greater level of resilience. Very importantly, I'm not talking about positive thinking here, pretending. I'm truly talking about surfacing the true want to that is beneath your have to. So with that, I think we are at the end of our time. I'm so grateful to all of you who've joined us. If any of you are interested, I've got a free quiz, which is susandavid.com/learn. And it's a quiz about emotional agility, which talks to these very ideas. How do we thrive in the world? susandavid.com/learn. It's a free quiz. You get a 10-page report that comes out of it. And if any of you have additional questions that you want to ask, please feel free to do so. I'll often, in the afternoon or later on tomorrow, hop online and answer some of those questions in the comments. So I'm grateful to all of you for joining, and I hope that this has been useful. Thank you.